Hello everyone, welcome to Pete's CD Vinyl World. Today I wanted to do a review of the Zappa documentary in Blu-ray that came out earlier this year. Finally around to getting it done. So this was actually directed and produced by Alex Winter, who you might know from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Um, So this is a documentary more about his life rather than his musical career, if that makes sense. It's does have a lot of his musical and bands, albums, but overall it's more about his life rather than his musical career, if that makes sense. It's 2 hours and 7 minutes, which I think was pretty short because if whoever is going to see this is probably a fan of his to begin with. So I was hoping for a little bit longer of a doc, like either the Tom Petty or Eagles ones, which are like two parts that are like 2 hours each. So I think it could easily have been even longer than that. So the documentary starts out sort of in his last performances, one of his last performances in Prague, where he was conducting an orchestra. That era is sort of forgotten about because it didn't take place in America, I guess. But yeah, the last couple of years, 91 and 92, he did conduct some orchestras that played his music for him. So it quickly goes to that, to sort of the beginning of his life, is where he grew up in California. And he grew up around a lot of companies that produce like poison gas and stuff for wars, and they needed to keep gas masks in the house. But eventually they moved to the Valley, specifically Lancaster, California, and they show a lot of 8mm movies he made at the time with his brothers and sister, zombie movies, that type of thing. So he, in the beginning, also it shows portion of his vault where he has all of those tapes from when he was a kid. Ironically, he says his family was not into music. He didn't really hear a lot of music growing up, but when he was 14, he got into music. Particular an album by Edgar Varese, which is basically atonal noise music. So he eventually found the album and was highly influenced that. And he also got into R&B, blues, doo-wop. Eventually, actually, he worked for a greeting card company and did some illustrations for greeting cards, and it was called the Frank Zappa collection as well, which is odd because he didn't really have a name for himself. But I wonder, I was curious about looking online for some of them, if they're, available or worth a lot. Eventually taught himself the guitar was by listening to blues records, and down the line got into doing some movie scores, which he had actually taken over or purchased a recording studio in Cucamonga, California. From there, sort of got his initial bands together, played in some R&B or blues cover bands, and eventually formed the Mothers of Invention. So all the while, he sort of, I guess, was like sort of offbeat from the beginning. If you're a fan of his, you know that he was never really mainstream. Although if you listen to his music, especially from the 70s on, he does have some mainstream music. Maybe not lyrically, but he's done some blues, reggae type stuff. So we went on to form the Mothers, and it goes into them a little bit as far as how they performed, and there's a lot of footage of them at the theater in New York where they had a run of like 10 shows or so, or a month-long residency. But then eventually describes how he was losing so much money just from touring. He was losing like $10,000 a tour back then, which was a lot. Doesn't really go into the whole documentary itself doesn't really go into his albums per se. It does mention Freak Out his first album a little bit. But beyond that, I would say there's maybe a couple mentions of like Shake Your Booty or a couple other albums here and there, but in general does not really get into his musical career. It mentions how he overall is a mixture of jazz, blues, comedy, rock, hard rock. So he runs the gamut musically, and eventually got into orchestration. And it shows him later on with the LSU Orchestra, and then later on with the Yellow Shark Ensemble, where it sort of ends up. So it gets into the 70s, goes into a little bit of the lineup, which is with Flo and Eddie from the Turtles. Actually probably my least favorite era of Frank Zappa, just because it's based more on vaudeville rather than the musical part of it, and I really don't think a lot of it is that funny nowadays. I think his music later on was more humorous, like Shake Your Booty and stuff into the 80s, but some of that early 70s stuff is just, I don't know. And some people love that lineup, but you can't love everything, I guess. So really jumps from the early 70s to really like the late 70s. All of a sudden it shows a concert clip of him from 77, which is from the Baby Snakes movie. Then shows him on Saturday Night Live. Again, it's more of him culturally, how his cultural impact was rather than musical. Goes into a little bit about the war he had with Warner Brothers Records. And I reviewed this 3 times so far, and I've tried to look at it as if you didn't know anything about him or anything about his music. And I know I would probably be confused if I didn't know anything about his music. I think this is definitely geared more for someone who was a big fan of his music, or at least familiar with his music, and wanted to know about his personal life. So it goes into him being a family man, which really isn't that well known. There's a lot of footage, and I'm sure there's more of his kids growing up, from a baby through, in the 80s when they're all young. A lot of footage of that in there. So I'm sure there's a lot more out there. Also, there's a lot of background music, I think, which was him. It was his. It's on the soundtrack, which I don't know if they're just unreleased pieces or whatnot. But when showing like the whole movies of like the kids when they were babies, and it's just him, say, on the road and showing the background music, it's kind of eerie music. I don't know how best to describe it unless you see it, but it definitely gives you a weird chill, because you don't know him as sort of like the dad. Even though he had his studio at home and everything, supposedly he worked 12, 16 hours a day and rarely came up from his studio. As it gets into the 80s, it doesn't really focus too much on his musical output. Really jumps from the early 80s, or even like Shake Your Booty, to the 1985 PRMRC hearings in Congress where he testified on. He goes into that a bit. Then jumps to sort of the 88 tour, which he doesn't really mention why. They don't mention why it was ended, that tour. Zappa fans know all about that infamous tour. Then briefly sort of goes into him first getting sick with cancer, and how his last couple years were spent. A good chunk of this actually is spent focusing on his last couple years with the first in Prague, then later on I believe in France with the Yellow Shark Ensemble. Maybe I'm wrong. But it goes into a lot of that, which for, I think, American audiences, we weren't even aware that he was doing any of that stuff. I know he put out the Yellow Shark CD in the 90s, but beyond that, I don't even think people realized he played guitar in Prague. It was a couple years after the 88 tour, or 3 years after. So those are his last performances playing guitar, and they're showing quite a bit of that in here. But again, overall, I think this is a good summary of his life in general. It does have few interviews here and there with some former band members, but I don't think nearly enough. Probably the longest band member that has some interviews is Ruth Underwood, who played with him in the 70s. A little bit of Steve Vai, some Ike Willis, Scott Tunez. But again, if I didn't know anything about his music or career, another thing is I don't want to say very little of his music in here, but it just shows short clips here and there, and not much of how influential he was as a guitar player as well. So that would be my major complaint about it. As far as the DVD or Blu-ray, the quality, most of the footage obviously is older, from the late 60s through the 80s. Like I said, also there's 8mm footage of him as a kid filming his family. So besides the new interviews with ex-bandmates, nothing is really in high def or whatever. So the fact that it's a Blu-ray really is irrelevant. And there's only a couple of small little clips as far as extras, which is really disappointing. I'm hoping maybe they'll put out a deluxe one of these with an extra disc of footage or concert footage, because it does show the vault. And from, I believe, the late 60s on, he recorded basically every show and videotaped a lot of them, so it's all there. And now that we have this about his life, why not do not a sequel but a companion documentary which is strictly about his music? I think that's what we really need, or the fans want, because he has access to all these tapes. Don't know what happened to his storage facility, because his house was actually bought by Lady Gaga. I don't know if she kept everything intact, because his storage for his tapes were all underground, under his front lawn or whatever. So I don't know what the deal is, if they've been moved or all digitized. The family's been slowly releasing, since he's passed away, slowly releasing archival stuff. But I would say, if you're a fan of his, definitely worth seeing. It's on Hulu if you just want to watch it. And I plan on getting the soundtrack too, because there's a lot of, I think, unreleased stuff on there as well. But overall, I highly recommend it, especially if you're a Zappa fan. I don't think he's talked about enough on the vinyl community, or even just music channels in general. And it's odd, because I think sort of his musical importance has gone away in the past 20 years. If you had asked in say the year 2000, he would have been considered one of the best composers. Now he's sort of not mentioned as much. And the weird thing about him, I don't know if you've noticed this about some celebrities or musicians. Some musician, he died in 1993, and it doesn't seem like he's been gone that long. Maybe only a year, 5 years. Other musicians, like say Freddie Mercury, who died only a couple years before Zappa, it seems like he's been gone for 30 years, But other people, it seems like it's always fresh when they've passed away, and it just seems that he's still here, or just passed away. So again, that's my review of this. I would recommend it to a fan, like I said. And if you like these videos, please subscribe, and I'll talk to you later. Thanks.